The spotlight was blazing hot on the stage of the Elmwood Casino in Windsor, Ontario, and Tony Bennett was supposed to be halfway through his opening number. Instead, he stood frozen at the microphone, staring out at an audience that was whispering, shifting uncomfortably, and waiting for him to sing. But Tony wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking at the empty tables in the front section, the section that had been cordoned off with velvet ropes and a small handwritten sign that made his stomach turn whites only. It was September 15th, 1957, and Tony Bennett was 31 years old, at the height of his early success. Because of You had made him a star. Rags to Riches was climbing the charts, and he was commanding top dollar at venues across North America. But as he stood on that stage in Windsor, none of that mattered. What mattered was the group of black jazz fans who had driven 3 hours from Detroit, paid their money at the door, and been told they could only sit in the back section of the casino. What Tony Bennett did in the next 60 seconds wouldn't just make headlines across 2 countries. It would establish him as one of the first major white entertainers to take a public stand against segregation, 8 years before the Civil Rights Act made such discrimination illegal. But it would also nearly destroy his career and put his life in danger in ways that no one could have predicted. To understand what happened that night in Windsor, you need to understand what America was like in 1957. This was the height of the Jim Crow era, when segregation wasn't just accepted, it was enforced with violence. 3 years earlier, 14-year-old Emmett Till had been murdered in Mississippi. Just weeks before Tony's performance, 9 black students had tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, requiring federal troops for protection. The entertainment industry was still largely segregated. Black performers like Nat King Cole, Harry Belafonte, and Sammy Davis Jr. were beginning to break through to mainstream white audiences. But they often performed under humiliating conditions. They couldn't stay in the same hotels, couldn't eat in the same restaurants, and frequently performed for segregated audiences where black fans were relegated to separate inferior seating areas. Most white entertainers stayed silent. It was simply too dangerous, economically and sometimes physically, to take a public stand. Record companies, booking agents, and venue owners made it clear that performers who caused trouble about racial issues would find their careers quickly ended. The unspoken rule was simple: sing your songs, collect your money, and don't ask questions about who's in the audience. Tony Bennett had grown up in Queens, in a working-class Italian-American family that had taught him to treat all people with respect. His father had died when Tony was 10, and his mother, Anna, had worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat. The Benedetto family knew what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be treated as second-class citizens. Tony had served in World War II, where he had fought alongside black soldiers and witnessed the liberation of concentration camps. He understood what hatred and discrimination could lead to. The Elmwood Casino booking had seemed routine when Tony's manager, Ray Muscarella, had negotiated the contract 3 months earlier. Windsor was just across the river from Detroit, with a thriving music scene and large population of jazz fans. The money was good, $5,000 for a 3-night engagement, and the venue was respectable. What Ray hadn't mentioned, and what Tony hadn't thought to ask about, were the casino's seating policies. Tony arrived at the Elmwood on September 15th for a sound check and was immediately struck by the tension in the air. The casino staff seemed nervous, whispering among themselves and avoiding eye contact. The stage manager, a heavy-set man named Mickey Torino, seemed particularly agitated as he showed Tony around the facility. "Listen, Tony," Mickey said as they walked through the main showroom. "We might have some complications tonight. Nothing you need to worry about, just some local politics." Tony looked around the elegant room, and noticed the rope barriers and small signs that had been placed around the front tables. What kind of complications? Mickey shifted uncomfortably. We got some colored folks coming tonight, and management wants to keep things orderly. Separate seating areas, you understand. Nothing personal, just business. Tony felt his stomach drop. Mickey, he said carefully, are you telling me that black fans can't sit in the same section as white fans? Mickey nodded. That's the policy. They can come to the show, but they sit in the back. Keeps everybody happy, you know. Tony spent the next few hours wrestling with his conscience. He could perform as scheduled and pretend not to notice. Most entertainers did exactly that. Or he could take a stand that might end his career. At 7 p.m., an hour before showtime, Tony found Mickey backstage. I want to talk to management. Mickey looked worried. Tony, please don't make waves. This is just how things are done here. But Tony was insistent. Get me whoever's in charge. Now, the casino owner, Vincent Marcelli, was a thin, sharp-dressed man with cold eyes and a reputation for not tolerating disruption. When Mickey brought Tony to Marcelli's office, the owner barely looked up from his paperwork. What's the problem, kid? Tony took a breath. Mr. Marcelli, I understand you have a policy about seating arrangements for Negro patrons. Marcelli finally looked up, his expression hardening. What about it? Tony kept his voice steady. I can't perform for a segregated audience. Either everyone sits wherever they want to sit, or I don't go on stage. The room went silent. Mickey's face went pale. You're kidding me, right? You're gonna throw away a $5,000 payday over where a few colored folks sit? It's not about money, Tony said. It's about what's right. These people paid the same ticket price as everyone else. Marcelli's voice turned ice cold. Listen here, you little punk. This is my casino, and I set the rules. You signed a contract to perform 3 shows, and you're gonna perform them exactly as scheduled. Otherwise, you'll never work in this town again, and I got friends in Detroit, Chicago, and New York who'll make sure you never work in their towns either. Tony looked directly into Marcelli's eyes. Then I guess I'll have to find a different line of work. With that, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mickey scrambling behind him. Word of the confrontation spread through the casino like wildfire. The 800-seat showroom was already full, with people who had paid premium prices to see Tony Bennett. Many had driven hours to be there. As 8 p.m. approached, Mickey frantically tried to convince Tony to reconsider. Tony, please, think about your career. But Tony had made his decision. Mickey, if I compromise on this, what's the next thing I'll compromise on? At 8:15 p.m., with the audience growing restless and Marcelli's threats growing more explicit, Tony walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, unaware of the drama that had been unfolding backstage. Tony approached the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, white faces in the front. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Tony said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Before I sing tonight, I want to say something important. Music doesn't see color. Music doesn't care about the color of your skin or where you come from. Music is for everyone, and when I perform for everyone equally. He paused, scanning the audience. I notice that some of you have been seated separately because of the color of your skin. I want you to know that's not my choice, and it's not right. A murmur went through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in agreement. In the back section, several black audience members sat up straighter, surprised to hear a white entertainer acknowledge their treatment so directly. So here's what we're going to do, Tony continued. I'm going to remove these rope barriers myself and I invite everyone to sit wherever they'd like to sit. This is a music show, not a political rally, but good music deserves to be heard by good people, regardless of race." Without waiting for a response, Tony walked to the edge of the stage, jumped down into the audience, and began removing the velvet ropes that separated the seating sections. The audience was stunned. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, several black patrons from the back section began walking toward the better seats in the front. Some white audience members got up and left in protest, but most stayed watching this unprecedented scene unfold. Vincent Marcelli appeared at the side of the stage, his face red with fury. He gestured frantically for Tony to stop, but Tony ignored him. When Tony climbed back onto the stage and picked up his microphone, Marcelli shouted, "You're finished, Bennett. You'll never work again." Tony looked directly at him and said, "Then I'll go out singing the right songs for the right reasons." What happened next was extraordinary. Tony launched into "Because of You," and the now integrated audience was completely captivated. The black fans who had been relegated to the back were now sitting in the front rows, and their enthusiasm was infectious. Tony performed for over an hour, delivering one of the most passionate shows of his career. Songs like "Blue Velvet" and "Rags to Riches" took on new meaning in front of an audience that was experiencing true integration for the first time. When Tony finished with "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," the standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. But the real impact was just beginning. Word of what Tony had done spread quickly through the entertainment world and the civil rights community. The Detroit Free Press ran a front-page story titled "Singer Breaks Color Barrier at Windsor Casino." The story was picked up by newspapers across the United States and Canada. As Marcelli had threatened, there were immediate professional consequences. Several venues canceled Tony's upcoming bookings. Some radio stations stopped playing his records. His booking agent received threatening phone calls from venue owners who didn't want to deal with a troublemaker. For a few months, it looked like Tony's stand might have ended his career. But something unexpected happened. The publicity from Windsor brought Tony to the attention of civil rights leaders who had been looking for white allies in entertainment. Harry Belafonte called personally to thank him and invite him to participate in benefit concerts for civil rights organizations. The NAACP asked him to perform at their annual convention. More importantly, many venue owners realized that integrated audiences were actually more profitable than segregated ones. Black music fans had disposable income and were eager to support entertainers who treated them with respect. Venues that had previously enforced segregation quietly began dropping their discriminatory policies. Over the following years, Tony continued to support civil rights causes, quietly but consistently. He performed at benefits for the NAACP and other organizations. He refused to perform at venues that maintained segregationist policies, even when it cost him money. In 1963, Tony was one of the entertainers who performed at the March on Washington, singing to the integrated crowd of 250,000 people who had gathered to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "S I Have a Dream" speech. Years later, Tony would say that the Windsor incident was one of the moments he was most proud of. "I could have just sung my songs and collected my money," he said, "but I learned something important that night. Sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is not perform, it's to stand up for what's right." The Elmwood Casino never again enforced segregated seating after the Tony Bennett incident. Vincent Marcelli, faced with pressure from civil rights groups and changing social attitudes, quietly abandoned his discriminatory policies. Several casino employees later said that the incident had cost him significant money and reputation. In 1987, 30 years later, Tony received a letter from Dorothy Johnson, a black woman who had been in the audience that night. She wrote, "Mr. Bennett, I was a 22-year-old school teacher from Detroit, and it was the first time I had ever been to see a white entertainer perform live. When you removed those ropes and invited us to sit in the front, you did more than integrate a casino. You showed me that there were white people who saw me as an equal human being. That night changed my life. Tony kept that letter for the rest of his life. It reminded him that sometimes the most important performances happen, not when you're singing, but when you're willing to risk everything for what you believe in. The night he refused to sing for a segregated audience and then performed for an integrated one had consequences that rippled through decades of American social progress. Today, the story of Tony Bennett at the Elmwood Casino is remembered as one of the early victories in the fight for civil rights in entertainment. It demonstrated that individual artists could make a difference, that taking a moral stand could inspire others to do the same, and that music really could bring people together across racial lines. The most important lesson of that night in Windsor is simple and profound. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in something you know is wrong, even when everyone around you is telling you it's just business as usual. Tony Bennett's refusal to sing for a segregated audience didn't just make him a hero. It showed that heroism is often just choosing decency over convenience, even when the cost is high. The microphone that Tony Bennett set down that night when he walked into the audience to remove the segregation barriers still exists, stored in the Smithsonian's collection of civil rights artifacts. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing an entertainer can do is not entertain. It's to take a stand for justice, even when the spotlight is shining and everyone is watching.